Hey, what's going on? This is Kext Next, and today I'm going to show you how you can create super easy photorealistic Jello inside of Blender with soft body physics. Now I want to say before I get started, there is a super awesome beginner tutorial on Tuts by Kai's channel, which I'll put a link in the description, and it just talks about soft body physics systems, and it goes over them for beginners. Also in this tutorial, I'll be using the Polygon Material Converter add-on, and I'll put a link in the description, and all it does is allows you to take these super nice looking textures from Polygon's website, and it puts them on your objects with their own mapping node, and it's super easy. So I'll link all of these in the description, plus these two textures I'll be using, the marble one and the fine wood texture. You can see the difference right here on screen. The image on the right is with these textures, and the image on the left is without them. You can see that they just add a very nice like little touch of realism to all your renders. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. So we actually want to use the default cube when creating our Jello, so we can go ahead and hide that for now. And we want something for our Jello to fall on. So let's go ahead and start making a bowl. So we can hit Shift A on the keyboard to create a new mesh and make a new UV sphere. And we can hit S to scale it up a little bit. And then we can hit Tab to go into edit mode, and make sure you're selecting vertices up here. Just go to the vertex selection method and you can select individual vertices. We want to select the top vertice on the sphere. And now if we hit G on the keyboard to move it around and then Z to move it along the Z axis, you can see it's really not doing much for us. So we want to go ahead and turn on proportional editing mode, which allows us to affect other vertices around the one we have selected. So now if we hit G and then Z to move it, you can see if we scroll down, we're affecting more and more vertices, and we can kind of make a bowl. So what I like to do is go into the side view by pressing 1 on the numpad, and then going to wireframe mode by pressing Z, going to wireframe. And now we can hit G and then Z to kind of make ourselves a little bowl here. Maybe something about like that. And another thing that I like to do is we go out of wireframe mode to Z, go back to solid. And I like to select a rim of vertices around the bowl. So to do that, you just hold down Alt and select an edge between two vertices, and it selects this loop. And then we can just kind of flatten out the bowl by hitting G and then Z. Maybe scroll up a little bit to select less vertices. Maybe something about like that, so we have a pretty flat looking bowl. And we can hit Tab to go out of editing mode, and this looks pretty good. We want this bowl to be at the origin though, so we can go up to Object, Set Origin, and then Geometry to Origin, so it's in the middle of our scene. And now we want to create a floor, so hit Shift A on the keyboard, go to Mesh, and then Plane, and just scale it up. And we don't want any clipping between our floor and the bowl, so we can kind of rotate under everything and make sure the plane is selected, and just hit G and then Z to move it down, and make sure that there is no geometry poking through the floor. And that looks pretty good. Now, you can see that we have a lot of noticeable faces, and there's some jagged edges in our bowl, so we can just select it, and we can go to the Modifiers tab, add a modifier, Subdivision Surface, and maybe turn it up to 2. Now, I don't know if you can see it, but on my screen I have this kind of star-shaped pattern in the middle, which is really ugly, and that's going to be a problem when we want textures on this bowl later on, but we'll go over some things to kind of mitigate that effect later on in the tutorial. But right now we can just kind of leave this, and we can right-click and hit Shade Smooth, and now we have a nice little bowl in our scene. So now that we have that, we can go ahead and start working with our Jello. So go ahead and turn the cube back on, and we want the simulation to start at frame 0. So go down here to your timeline, we can drag it up a little bit, and turn the start to 0. And I only want my video to be about 100 frames long, so set it about there. And now every time that you adjust a setting, you want to put your playhead back at 0. So let's go ahead and scale our cube down with S, about right there. Hit G and then Z on the keyboard to drag it up. We want to give it some room to drop onto the bowl. And now what we want to do is give the bowl collision physics. So let's go to the physics tab and add collision physics to the bowl, so that the cube will interact with it and it will just fall through our scene. And then we can select the cube and apply soft body physics. And if we hit play, we can see it just kind of bobs up and down in the air right now, and that's not what we really want. So we can go to goal and uncheck that. And now if we play the simulation, it hits the bowl, kind of jiggles up and down, and then falls over, collapses. And that is because, one, we don't have any stiffness on the cube, and two, the cube only has 8 vertices, and that's not what we want. So we can hit tab on the keyboard to go into edit mode, right click on the cube and hit subdivide, and do it maybe 2 more times so we have many vertices to work with. We go out of edit mode and hit play and see what it does. Alright, so now as you can see, it just kind of collapses into a blanket as soon as it hits the bowl. So let's give our cube a little bit of stiffness. We can go to the edges options and scroll that down and turn the bending up to about 1 and hit play and see what that does. So now we have this cube that is bouncing on our object, which looks pretty good. One thing that we can do is go to the modifier tab, add subdivision surface to give it even more faces, and then right click and hit shade smooth. And now we have our little Jello cube here. And you can see the more geometry that you have in your scene, the longer it takes to add these frames to the cache, and it's just kind of like trying to render out the simulation right here, which can be difficult for your computer. So in the physics settings over here, you can turn the pull and push settings up a little bit, and that just kind of controls the stiffness of the actual areas between your edges on your object. And then we can turn bending up a little bit to make the edges bend less. And I actually like to turn on collision edge for all of my renders, but it does take a little bit more time for your computer to calculate the simulation because it is calculating every single edge trying to interact with each other. So for the sake of the tutorial, I won't do that. But now if we play this, we can kind of see what it's doing. All right, so that looks pretty good. But let's say that you want your Jello to be a little bit more random than that. So we can go back to frame 0 and maybe select the Jello, hit R to rotate it, kind of rotate it in a random fashion. And then if we were to play this, we can kind of see what it's doing. So sometimes in your scene, your Jello may get stuck inside of the geometry of your collision object. And there's a couple things you can do to correct that. You can go to your object, and I would turn down the inner thickness a lot, because that does seem to cause some problems when you're working on a small scale with soft body physics, and turn the thickness of the outer edge up a little bit more. Another thing that I would do to fix edges of your actual object poking through other faces is select it, and you can turn on collision edge, and you can mess around with the bending. I've set mine to 4, and I've turned the damping up a little bit, and the damping just kind of lessens how springy your object is. So I've messed around with some settings, and I think that I've gotten my Jello to a pretty good point. All right, so now that we have our Jello, we can see that it's taking a while to actually create these animations, and sometimes Blender may even stop responding because it does take a lot out of the computer. Now when Blender stops responding, it is still trying to calculate the frames, and whenever it does come back online, you should have some extra frames waiting for you. But we don't want that to happen, so we can go to our objects that are moving, like the cube, and go to the cache right here. Now, you can see that in these settings, we have a different start and end point. So we want to make sure that it is starting on frame 0 and ending on however long our scene is. So my scene is 100 frames, so I'm gonna set it to 100 frames. If I hit bake all dynamics, the computer will run through the simulation, and it may take some time, but it'll completely render out, and then you can scrub through your animation super easily without it buffering. And this is really great when you are done messing around with the physics. But the only downside is once you do this, you cannot change the position of your objects, the rotation, or mess around with any of the physics settings. So make sure that you are done doing whatever you have to do. You can go back though and rebake by just going down here, and this button will say delete bake. And you have to do that for every object that has soft body physics on it. You have to delete bake, and then you can adjust them, but then you'll have to bake all dynamics again and wait for that to calculate out, and then you'll have your scene all set. Now, if I wanted to have multiple Jellos in my scene, so I can hit Shift D to duplicate this one, One thing that you have to keep in mind is that you have to add collision physics to both of these cubes, or else they will not interact with each other properly. The other thing is when you have more than one Jello in your scene, it is much harder for your computer to bake the simulation. It will take a lot more time, but the result will look really good, like right here. So, with that being said, I'm just going to do one cube for now, and I'll go ahead and bake the simulation. And I like to hit bake all dynamics because it makes it so that all physics systems in your scene will be baked with it, and I just like to be safe just in case. And there's actually another option that you can do if you already have some playable area down here. You can hit current cache to bake, and that playable area will become baked. But I don't have any, so I'm gonna go ahead and hit bake all dynamics. Alright, so I've gone ahead and baked my simulation, and now we have this little Jello bouncing around, and we can rotate around it, and it will not buffer at all, which is really great. The only problem is we can't change our Jello, but I like it how it is, so it's looking good. Now, I want to explain something really quickly, and that is the difference between baking and rendering on your computer. When you're baking physics simulations, it does not primarily use your computer's GPU. It actually uses your CPU. So in some cases, even if you have a great GPU, it could be a little bit slower on your computer. And that's just a fact of life, but rendering, when it comes to actually finishing off the scene, it does have to do with the GPU. So now that we have that done, let's go ahead and look at materials for our scene. So to do that, we can go ahead and go to the material view up here and click on material view, and everything is white right now, and that looks super ugly. First thing that we want to change is our Jello. So let's go to our Jello, select it, and go to the materials tab. And we should already have a material loaded in. And if we go down, we have the principled shader. We want to make it see-through, like a glass material. So to do that, all we have to do is just turn the transmission up. And you can't really see it right now because we're not in rendered view, so I'll go into rendered view so you can see it a little bit better. And for your renderer, you want to go up here to the render properties and set your render engine to cycles. And I like to set mine to GPU compute, and it does it faster. But now if we go back to the material tab, you can see this is see-through, and we can just turn our roughness down a little bit, and we have those sharp reflections on our cube. That actually looks pretty nice, and that's all we had to do. To change the color, you just scroll up and go to the base color and change it to whatever you like. I personally like some reddish Jello because I think it's kind of the classic color. But there we go, we have some Jello now. But now we want to add a material to our bowl and our floor. So we know this is see-through, and when we go to our material view, it won't be see-through, but this is just a preview pretty much. So, but we want to add a material to our bowl and our floor. So for our bowl, if we go to the materials tab, and we add a new material, and then we kind of close these up and we scroll down a little bit, we can see we have our polygon material converter add-on right here, which you can enable in user preferences and just search for it and enable it. And then you can just find your folder that you have your materials located in. And I'll link a tutorial on how to use this add-on in the description below, but it's not completely necessary. It just makes your scene look a lot better. So we can go ahead and select our bowl, and I think I'll apply the wood material to it. So I'll just hit load and apply material, and already it gives us this super nice looking wood material. And for our plane, I'll just select the plane, maybe go to the marble and hit load and apply material again. And now look at that. We already have a great looking scene. You can see that on our bowl down here, we have this crinkly little center, and we do want to fix that. So we can select it and go to tab to go into edit mode. And we want to maybe go to the modifiers tab and turn off subdivision surface for now, just so we can kind of mess with this. And let's just take this little loop of vertices. So we can hold down Alt and select an edge in between some vertices down here. And we want to make sure proportional editing is turned off. So I'm going to hit O on the keyboard to turn it off, or you can just click this button up here. And we want to hit S and just kind of scale the center in, and maybe even bring this vertex up a little bit. And we can even scale the next ring down, and just trying to get it looking right. So now we have a much smaller kind of spot in the middle of the bowl, but you know, that looks pretty nice now. So we can go ahead and turn our cube back on, and you can preview it. And you know, this looks pretty good, but our Jello doesn't look that vibrant, and that's because of the type of lighting we have in our scene. So we can go ahead and drag out another window down here. So we have two windows. Let's set this one to material preview. And let's go ahead and just set up our camera angles real quick so we can kind of see what our scene is going to look like. So we can hit 0 on the numpad to go into camera view. And we want to connect our camera to our view. So let's hit in and go into view and hit lock camera to view. And then hit in again to get rid of that. And now when we rotate around, our camera will be locked to this view. I'm going to try to drag this over a little bit. And we just want to find a pretty good looking angle for our Jello. I kind of want it to be over here so you kind of get to see the ramp. And that looks pretty good. And keep in mind that you can adjust the focal length of the camera at this point as well. So select the camera, go to the camera settings, and I like to make it a really high focal length because when you're doing macro photography, they use a macro lens, which usually is just a very long focal length with a small aperture. So we can just kind of make a really large focal length and then zoom out a little bit with our mouse. Maybe about right there. I can do 250. We could even select our plane and bring it up a little bit to get rid of that sharp edge on the bowl. And what I like to do when I'm in the camera view in rendered, I like to go to this tab right here, the output properties, and select render region. And you'll only be able to see what your actual camera sees. And I find that helpful for kind of adjusting the composition of your shots. So that looks pretty good right there. We can drag this window over here maybe a little bit and hit in on the keyboard and disconnect the camera from the view. Do the same over here, make sure it's disconnected, yep. And now we can, rotate without taking the camera with us, but hit 0 to go back into camera view. At this point in our scene, we want to adjust the lighting. So what we can do is on this side over here, we can hit 7 on the numpad to go to the top view. And we just want to go ahead and start playing with lights. So we already have this 1 point light in our scene and it's white, and we can actually kind of mess around with that one. So let's drag it and we know our camera is over here. So when you have lights in your scene, if they're behind the Jello tends to look a little bit more vibrant. So we can take it, maybe hit G and then Z to take the light down a little bit. That looks pretty good. We can duplicate the light with Shift D and drag it over here maybe and create kind of a rim light. And we can even change the color of it. Maybe orange, that looks pretty good. Kind of like it's complementing the red and a nice, right, yellowish. Maybe do another light behind the Jello over here on this side. And maybe make this one white. I don't really like it there. We can, and just kind of play around with lighting because really this is where you really get to make your scene pop and you really get to make it look its best. Maybe we can even turn this light's intensity down with the power and set it to another orangish color. And I also like to add some sun lamps in my scene, so you can hit Shift A, go to light, and then sun, and just kind of drag it up a little bit. And then you can hit R and then Y to rotate it along a specific axis, in this case the Y axis. And I like to add 2 sun lamps into my scene and kind of crisscross them. So R and then Z. It really all just depends on what you're doing. You can Shift D to duplicate the sun lamp, R and then Z, and make it just look really saucy. You know what I mean? In my opinion, lighting is one of the most artistic parts of the actual process, and you get to play with like so much color in your scene and make it look all fancy and stuff. And it's one of my favorite things to do. So you can just hit RY maybe and rotate it up a little bit. And maybe you could even make this like a night scene. So if you want to adjust the colors of your materials that you've gotten from the polygon add-on, you can just select the object that you want to edit and go into the shading workspace here. And it's already set up some groups for you. And this is the mapping node and this is the actual texture itself. It's a group, so you can go into these little settings right here, and it already has everything labeled for you in here, so you can go to the basic adjustments tab and maybe even take the color down a bit of your, here we can go into rendered view so we can see what it looks like. Take the brightness of it down. That actually looks kind of cool, I like that. And then we can, select the bowl, and it should have some material setup too. You can go to the groups, go to the basic adjustments for the color. Of course, color, it says it's labeled color adjust, and you turn the value down for that as well. And then we can go back to our layout. And that actually looks kind of cool. I could maybe take this sun lamp right here and rotate it. See if less of that kind of reflection coming through. Yeah, and I don't like seeing all of these axes and the floor in here, so I can go to this little thing up here that has all your overlays in it, and you can turn off the floor and the X and Y axis to kind of just see your scene. And another thing that I like to do is go to the mapping node and maybe turn up the scale a little bit, and this will make more of the texture. This will scale the texture down actually, so it's almost opposite. You're really just like, see, if I have this scale set to 1 compared to 5, you have more detail in the texture itself. So, layout. And that looks pretty cool, and I think we're actually almost ready to render. Now, before we do anything, let's kind of drag this window over. And we can go to the render properties. Let's set the render amount to a lower number because we're going to use the denoiser in Blender to get rid of all of the grain that we have. I would suggest not going under 30. I usually render these at about 50 samples, but we can do 40-ish samples. And I set this to branched path tracing. And depending on what kind of computer you have, I would suggest actually turning up the transmission amount. It'll render the inside of our Jello more than some of the other parts of the scene, but I'm gonna leave that be for right now. And then I'd like to go to the color management tab and make sure that this is set to filmic, because you can kind of see the difference between filmic and standard. Filmic looks a little bit nicer, and then we can kind of adjust the exposure settings of our scene a little bit, maybe the gamma as well. We can even give it some contrast or take some contrast out of it, and I think that looks pretty nice. So before we actually render the scene out, let's go to the compositing tab, and we want to apply a denoiser. So turn on the use node checkbox. And we haven't rendered an image yet, but Blender will detect this once we do. And we're just gonna do a simple little denoising plugin. So if we hit Shift A to apply a new node, and we type in denoiser, it'll take this little thing right here. And we can go down here to the layer properties and turn on denoising data and just plug all these 3 settings into the proper slots. And this will just take all of the noise out of our image, and it'll look a lot better. So to kind of test, we can maybe move to frame 58, hit render and render image, and it will render our work. All right, so this is our rendered image, and it looks pretty good, but I think, and you can kind of see some artifacts down here, and that comes from not giving the computer enough samples. So maybe we can close out of this, and I just want to do a few more things. If you're rendering out an animation, I would turn on motion blur, because that's important and it helps it a little bit. And I think if you have something this small, it should have a pretty noticeable depth of field. So let's select our camera and go to the camera settings and turn on depth of field, and everything will get blurry. Then we want to go to the viewport display and turn on camera limits. And this will allow us to kind of see where our depth of field is. So as we turn up the distance, you can see that this cross is getting smaller on screen, and it's getting closer to our Jello here. And we kind of just want to put this cross in the middle of our Jello right here, about like that. And this will be what our camera is focusing on. And then we can just turn down the f-stop a bit till we get an effect that we like. And all right, and when you actually have to render your scene out, I would recommend creating a folder somewhere on your computer and setting the color to RGB and rendering it as each frame as a PNG image, and then you can put it together in Premiere or even in Blender, and I'll link a tutorial down below from Blender Guru, who does a really good tutorial on that. It's in his beginner tutorial series. And now we can go ahead and render out an image and see what it looks like. So as you can see, our render result looks really, really awesome. And I actually turned up the amount of samples for this one, but you see there's less artifacts, and I think it just looks really, really nice with these materials and the lighting setup. And that is how you create photorealistic Jello inside a Blender with soft body physics. Thank you so much for watching. I think this one may have been a long one. I kind of let it get away from me. I try to keep it kind of straight and to the point. If you liked my content, please subscribe to my channel. We just passed 1,000 subscribers, which is amazing. Thank you so much. And leave a comment down below if you want to see more content like this, or if you have something else in mind. I usually do After Effects tutorials, but I am trying to put more Blender content out because I've recently kind of gotten back into it when Blender 2.8 came out. So it's been pretty cool. It's been pretty fun. Thank you so much for watching my content. And I am Kext Next, and I will see you next time.